The night was dark and heavy with snow. The storm screamed through the steel walls of the human colony, shaking every window, rattling every metal door. The cold outside was not simple cold. It was death. Anyone caught in it for long minutes would turn to ice, silent forever. In the middle of that deadly storm, an alien widow staggered through the snow, her arms tight around a small child, her thin cloak whipped in the wind, useless against the freezing air. The child cried softly, his voice breaking in the storm. Every step the widow took sank deep into the white ground, each one slower than the last. Her eyes burned with fear and hope as she looked at the glowing lights of the colony houses. She reached the first metal door, her hand shaking as she banged on it. "Please open, help us." Her voice cracked. Inside the house, shadows moved, but no one came. The light went off, leaving her in darkness. She forced herself to the next house. Her fist struck the door again, her child shivering in her arms. This time the window slid open a little. A human face peeked out, full of anger. "We don't help your kind, go away before the guards come," the voice hissed. The window slammed shut. The sound was final. The widow's heart sank. But she kept walking. Snow clung to her legs like chains, pulling her down. House after house refused her. Some ignored her, others shouted insults. She was not welcome. Her people had once fought a war near this colony, and though that war was long over, the hate was not. To them she was a danger, a curse. But she was only a mother with a freezing child. The storm grew worse. The widow's lips turned blue. Her child's small hands were stiff with frost. She fell to her knees in the snow, clutching the boy close. Her eyes filled with tears that froze on her skin. She looked up at the last row of houses, her strength fading. "One more try," she whispered to herself. One more. Her hand rose, weak and trembling, striking the final door she could reach. Her knock was softer now, barely a tap. For a long moment, nothing happened. The storm howled louder. The widow felt her child's body grow still. Her heart almost stopped. This was the end. Then the sound of metal shifting. The door creaked open, light spilling into the storm. A tall human stood there, his face shadowed by the glow of the lamp behind him. His name was Ethan, a worker in the colony. He had heard the cries, felt the pounding of her desperate hands on his door, and unlike the others, he did not turn away. For a moment, Ethan just stared at her. Her alien face was marked with sorrow, her child half unconscious in her arms. His training told him not to interfere. The colony laws were strict. Aliens were forbidden inside human homes. But his heart twisted as he watched her shiver in the deadly wind. If he closed the door, she and the child would die right there, right now. The widow lowered her head, whispering, "Please, just the child, save him." Ethan's jaw tightened. His thoughts raced. He knew what this meant. Trouble, punishment, maybe exile. But in that moment he chose. Without a word, he stepped aside and pulled the door open wider. "Come inside," he said, his voice firm. The widow gasped, clutching her child as she staggered across the threshold. Warmth wrapped around them like life itself. The door shut against the storm, silence filling the small room. Ethan hurried to bring blankets, pressing them into the widow's shaking hands. He set hot water on the heater, his mind still spinning with fear and doubt. He knew the guards would patrol soon. They might check doors. They might notice the tracks in the snow. Helping her was dangerous, reckless, forbidden. But as he looked at the child, slowly breathing again, his chest rising weakly under the blanket, Ethan felt a strange strength. He had done the right thing, even if the whole colony turned against him. The widow's eyes lifted, full of gratitude and fear. "You. Why?" she whispered. Ethan shook his head, staring at the door as the storm battered it from outside. "Because no one else did," he answered. The wind howled louder, as if warning them both of the danger that had just begun. In the colony outside, lights still burned in the windows. But no one knew what Ethan had done. No one yet knew that a human had broken the law, had opened his door to an alien widow. But soon, The colony would learn, and when they did, Ethan's life, and hers, would never be the same. The storm still screamed outside, but inside Ethan's small home, there was only silence. The alien widow sat close to the heater, her child wrapped in thick blankets, steam rising from the cup of hot water in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with exhaustion, but there was life again in her child's weak breathing. Ethan watched them from across the room, his hands restless, his thoughts heavy. He knew what he had done. It was not only dangerous, it was forbidden. The colony had laws, and those laws were sharp like knives. No alien was allowed inside human living space, no shelter, no food, no help. Anyone who broke this law was punished, sometimes exiled, sometimes worse. Ethan's comm screen flickered on the wall, a red warning flashing. Storm patrol active, curfew in place, random home searches authorized. His stomach tightened. They would come soon, the guards, moving from door to door, checking for disobedience. If they found her here, both she and Ethan would be dragged into the snow, never to return. The widow's voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her alien accent gentle, her eyes never leaving his. Ethan looked away, his jaw tight. "Because I couldn't let you die at my door," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. She lowered her gaze, clutching her child closer, whispering something in her own language, words Ethan could not understand. Outside, heavy boots echoed in the hallway, muffled but growing louder. Ethan froze, his breath caught. The guards were near, maybe 2 doors away, their scanners humming as they searched for heat signatures. He moved quickly, pulling a small panel from the floor, revealing a narrow crawl space. "Inside," he whispered harshly. "Hide. Don't make a sound." The widow's eyes widened with fear, but she obeyed, slipping down into the darkness with her child. Pulling the panel closed above her, Ethan grabbed a cloth, wiping the floor where their wet footprints had melted snow. He tossed the blankets into the heater, the smell of burning fabric filling the room. His heart raced, every movement desperate but careful. The sound of boots stopped outside his door. A loud knock thundered through the walls. "Open up, patrol!" a voice barked. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing calm, and opened the door. 2 guards in heavy armor stood there, their visors glowing with scanner light, snow dripping from their shoulders. "Routine search," one said, pushing past Ethan without waiting. Ethan stood still, his fists clenched behind his back. The guards scanned every corner, their lights cutting through the shadows. One stopped near the floor panel. Pausing, Ethan's heart nearly burst in his chest. The guard tapped the panel with his boot, listening, but after a tense moment he moved on. The child below had not made a sound, not even a breath. Ethan silently thanked fate. One of the guards turned to him, his voice sharp. "You live alone, don't you?" "Yes," Ethan answered quickly, his voice steady. The guard narrowed his eyes, studying Ethan's face. "You look nervous." Ethan forced a laugh. "Storm makes everyone nervous, doesn't it?" The guard stared a moment longer, then finally stepped back. "We'll be watching, don't forget that," he said before leaving into the storm. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in Ethan's skull. Only when the footsteps faded did Ethan pull open the floor panel. The widow climbed out slowly, her child still pressed to her chest. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. Ethan helped her stand, his own body weak with relief. "You risked everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head. "No, I risked nothing compared to what you risk every second." But even as he spoke, he knew the danger had grown. The guards had seen his nervousness. They had noticed his eyes. They would remember. Suspicion was like fire in this colony. It spread fast and destroyed everything in its path. He had saved them once, but how long could he keep saving them? The widow looked at him with something more than fear now, something like trust. "My mate once saved humans," she said softly, "and he died for it. They called him traitor, but he was not." Her words cut deep, echoing in Ethan's chest. He wanted to ask more, but outside another patrol passed, louder this time. The storm was not ending soon, and neither was the danger. Ethan stared at the locked door, knowing it was only a matter of time before it opened again, and next time the guards might not leave. Next time they might find the widow. Next time Ethan might not have the strength or the luck to protect her. The room was warm, but the air was heavy with fear. Ethan's choice had been made, but the cost of it was only beginning. The colony was watching, the law was waiting, and the storm outside was not the only storm coming for them. The storm had not ended. Snow still pressed against the metal walls of the colony, howling winds shaking doors and windows. Inside Ethan's small home, the alien widow and her child rested, safe for the moment. But Ethan knew safety was only an illusion. The colony had eyes, and suspicion was already turning toward him. Ethan sat at his table, staring at the dim light above, his thoughts drifting back to the past. He remembered the war, the one that shaped the colony's hatred. He had been young then, working as a mechanic for the defense fleet. The enemy had attacked with fire and poison, cities burning, skies filled with falling ships, and in the middle of that chaos the aliens, her people, were accused of betrayal. The memory was still sharp, the rumor that their signal codes had been leaked, that human ships had fallen because of them. No proof had ever been shown, but hatred needed no proof, only anger. From that day the colony had treated every alien as an enemy. No one cared if a widow or child froze outside the gates. They had already been judged guilty. Ethan looked at the widow sitting by the heater, her head bowed, her child asleep in her lap. Her skin shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Not human, but not frightening. She was tired, but her eyes carried stories. Heavy stories. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. They say your people betrayed us, gave away codes during the war. The widow's eyes lifted, sadness in every line of her face. It is not true, she whispered. My mate, he gave his life to save humans, not destroy them. He opened a shield corridor for your fleet, and the enemy cut him down for it. Her hands tightened around her child as if the memory still burned. But lies travel faster than truth, she added, her voice bitter like the wind outside. Ethan felt a weight in his chest. If her words were true, then the colony had built its hate on shadows, and he had just broken the law for a woman wrongly accused. It was dangerous, but it was also right. Still, danger pressed closer. That evening, as the storm eased, neighbors walked past Ethan's door more than usual. He heard their whispers, their footsteps pausing. Some even knocked lightly, pretending to greet, but their eyes searched behind him. Their noses sniffed for strange scents. The colony lived on suspicion, and Ethan's silence was now louder than any shout. He spent hours building secret hiding spots. The crawl space under the floor was not enough, so he shifted panels in the wall, creating hollow gaps where sound would not carry. Every hammer strike echoed through the room, and every time he paused, fearing the guards would hear, the widow helped when she could, moving quietly, her child always close to her chest. They worked in silence, fear binding them together more tightly than words. But Ethan's fear was not only for the guards. It was for his friend Daniel. Daniel was a fellow worker, a man Ethan had known since youth. They had shared food during shortages, laughed in quiet moments, trusted each other when machines failed in the deep mines. And Daniel was sharp, too. Sharp. He noticed small things, the kind of man who asked questions until answers cracked open. That night Daniel came. His knock was familiar, steady, a friend's knock. Ethan opened the door, forcing a smile. Storm's bad, thought I'd check on you, Daniel said, stepping inside without waiting. His eyes swept the room, the corners, the heater, lingering too long. You've been busy, he added, nodding toward the tools. Still on the table. Just repairs, Ethan lied, his voice calm. But Daniel's gaze was sharp, searching. The widow was hidden, her child silent. But Ethan felt the weight of her presence behind the wall, every second stretched like a blade against his throat. Daniel leaned back against the door, folding his arms. You've always followed rules, Ethan, always careful, always straight, but lately, something feels different. Ethan forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. Storm makes everyone restless. he said again, repeating the lie he had used on the guards. Daniel did not laugh. His eyes narrowed, and silence grew between them, heavy, dangerous. Finally, Daniel pushed off the door, giving Ethan a long look. "You know the council is watching everyone right now," he said slowly. "Rumors of outsiders, troublemakers, people breaking rules." Ethan nodded, saying nothing. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, firm. "Whatever you're doing, Ethan, don't let it ruin you." Then he left. The door shutting behind him, Ethan stood frozen, his breath unsteady. Had Daniel guessed, or was it only suspicion? Either way, trust had turned fragile. If Daniel decided to speak to the guards, the widow and her child would be finished and Ethan's life would burn with theirs. The widow stepped out of her hiding place, her eyes wide with fear. "Who was he?" she whispered. "A friend," Ethan said bitterly. "Maybe the last one I had." The storm outside roared again, shaking the walls as if to remind him that the world itself was against them. In that moment, Ethan understood. It was not only the guards or the law he had to fear, it was shadows of the past and the whispers of those closest to him. And shadows were sometimes the hardest to fight. The storm had weakened, but fear had not. Inside Ethan's small home, silence was their shield. The alien widow kept her child close, whispering soft words in her own tongue, words of comfort, words that humans would not understand. The boy was stronger now, his cheeks warmer, his eyes brighter. But with strength came danger, for children did not understand silence. And silence was the only thing keeping them alive. Ethan worked with tired hands, adjusting panels, moving tools, making new hiding places in the walls. Every strike of the hammer felt like thunder, every spark from the drill like a flare in the dark. He paused often, listening, always listening. Because the colony listened too, neighbors walked slower outside his door now. Some stood in the snow longer than needed, their eyes studying his window. Suspicion had roots, and those roots were digging deeper into Ethan's home. One evening, as the heater hummed, the child began to laugh. It was a soft laugh, innocent like sunlight breaking through clouds. But to Ethan it was the sound of danger. He froze, dropping his tool, his blood running cold. The widow hushed her child quickly, pressing her hand over his mouth, but it was too late. Outside the door, footsteps stopped. A voice whispered, "Did you hear that?" Another voice replied, sounded like a child. Then silence. The most dangerous silence of all. Ethan rushed to the door, peering through the small screen. Two neighbors stood close, pretending to adjust their cloaks, but their eyes were sharp, their ears turned toward his home. Ethan forced the door open, his face calm. "Problem?" he asked. The neighbors smiled too quickly, shaking their heads. "Storm's quiet tonight," one muttered, "just taking a walk." But Ethan saw the suspicion in their eyes. They left, but slowly, glancing back. The sound of the child's laugh had planted a seed, and that seed would grow. That night Ethan could not sleep. He sat at the table, staring at the door. The widow placed her child in the hidden crawl space, rocking him gently until he drifted into silence again. Her eyes met Ethan's, filled with fear. "He is only a child," she whispered. "He doesn't understand." Ethan's voice was tight. "Then he must learn, or we are finished." His words were sharp, but his heart ached as he said them. How could one ask silence from a child? But survival left no room for innocence. The next morning a knock came, not the heavy strike of guards, but a softer, careful knock. Ethan opened the door to see a council spy, one of the watchers. The man wore no armor, only plain clothes, but his eyes were colder than the storm. "Routine visit," the spy said, stepping in without invitation. He looked around slowly, his gaze sliding over every wall, every shadow. Ethan's chest tightened, sweat running down his back. The spy picked up one of Ethan's tools, turning it in his hand. "You work late," he said, his voice casual, but too casual. "Repairs," Ethan answered. "For what?" the spy asked, his eyes drilling into Ethan. Ethan forced a smile. "Storm damages pipes, heaters, everything, always fixing something," The spy placed the tool down, his lips curving slightly. "You've been nervous lately, neighbors talk." Ethan's fists clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "Storm makes everyone restless," he repeated. The spy said nothing more, only looked at him for a long moment, then left. But Ethan knew it was not over. The spy had not come to check. He had come to watch, to listen, to plant fear. That evening, the widow tried to keep her child silent, but the boy spoke again. He asked questions in his alien tongue, words strange and clear. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Ethan's heart slammed, his hands trembling as he rushed to hush him. But outside the window, a shadow moved. Someone was listening. Ethan yanked the lamp off the table, plunging the room into darkness. "Quiet," he hissed. "Not a sound." The widow held her child tight, rocking him, covering his mouth, tears in her eyes. The shadow outside lingered, then faded, but Ethan knew the truth. The colony had heard, maybe not the words, but the sound of a voice that should not exist inside his home. He sat in the dark for hours, waiting. Every creak of the walls, every whistle of the wind, made his body tense. Finally, he whispered to himself, "They will come soon." The widow's eyes met his, filled with dread. She clutched her child closer, her voice shaking. "Then what will we do?" Ethan had no answer. For the first time since he opened the door to her, he wondered if he had doomed them all. Outside, the storm had gone. The night was clear. And in that clear night, the colony watched closer than ever. The child had spoken, the silence had been broken, and silence once broken could never be restored. The colony slept, but Ethan could not. He sat at the table, the dim lamp flickering, his ears tuned to every sound outside his door. The widow and her child were hidden in the crawl space, their breathing soft. Silence filled the room, but it was not peace. It was the silence of waiting, the silence before disaster. Ethan's mind circled around one thought. Daniel. His friend had visited, his eyes sharp, his questions too careful. Ethan knew Daniel better than most. He was loyal, but loyalty had limits. Fear made men do strange things. And Daniel feared the council, feared exile, feared the label of traitor. If Daniel believed Ethan was hiding an alien, he might already have spoken. That fear became truth the next night. It began with pounding fists on his door, loud, heavy, impossible to ignore. "Open up," a guard shouted, his voice cold. Ethan's heart leapt, his blood turning to ice. The widow's eyes widened in the shadows of the crawl space, holding her child tightly. Ethan steadied his breath, opened the door, and faced the storm outside. 4 guards pushed inside, armored, their visors glowing with scanners. Behind them, Daniel stood, his face pale, his eyes refusing to meet Ethan's. Betrayal burned in that silence. Ethan's chest tightened, his fists trembling. But he said nothing, because words would not change what had already been done. The guards tore through his home, pulling open panels, searching the walls. One lifted the floor panel, scanning inside. Ethan's lungs froze, but the crawl space was empty. The widow had moved deeper into the narrow tunnels he had carved behind the heating system. The guard frowned, tapping the scanner, but it showed nothing. "Strange," he muttered. Neighbors swore they heard voices. Ethan forced a laugh, his voice thin. "Voices carry in storms, maybe from the street." The guard looked at him, suspicion in his eyes, but turned away. They searched for hours, ripping apart blankets, breaking open storage, scattering tools. But they found nothing. Finally, the lead guard stepped close to Ethan, his visor inches from his face. "You're lucky," the guard said, his voice a growl. "If we find proof, you'll be dragged into the snow. No trial, no mercy." Then they left. Daniel last, his eyes finally lifting to Ethan's, full of guilt. Ethan stared at him, his jaw tight, saying nothing. The door shut, leaving Ethan in ruins. The widow emerged from the dark, her child clinging to her, her face pale, her voice trembling. "Someone betrayed you," she whispered. Ethan's eyes burned. Not someone, he said coldly. Daniel. The widow lowered her head, sorrow in her eyes. She knew what betrayal meant. It was the same that had destroyed her people. It was the same that had taken her mate. Ethan began to repair the damage, but his hands shook with rage. Daniel's face haunted him, the guilt, the silence, the weakness. Friendship had been broken, and with it, the last thread tying Ethan to the colony. Now he was alone except for the widow and her child, and that truth hardened something inside him. The next day the guards returned, not with a search but with something worse. They planted small metal devices on his walls, tiny black discs that pulsed with faint light. Colony order, they said, monitoring for security. Ethan said nothing, his teeth clenched. He knew what they were. Listening ears, recording eyes. His home was no longer his own. Every sound, every word was now being watched. That night, as the widow tried to soothe her child, the boy sneezed. The sound echoed in the small room, sharp and clear. Ethan's blood turned to fire. He rushed to cover the boy's mouth. But it was too late. One of the black discs flashed red. Recording the sound, Ethan cursed under his breath, ripping the device from the wall, smashing it under his boot. But there were more. Too many. The council would see. The council would know. The widow's eyes filled with tears, fear shaking. Her voice, "We cannot stay, Ethan," she whispered. "They will kill us all." Ethan stared at the broken device on the floor, his jaw set. He knew she was right. The walls were no longer safe. The colony was no longer blind. And betrayal had already opened the path for their hunters. He sat in silence, listening to the storm return outside, his mind heavy with choices, his heart heavy with loss. Daniel's betrayal had destroyed the last piece of safety. Now only escape remained, but escape meant crossing the colony walls, passing the patrols, braving the storm itself. Few ever made it. Fewer survived. And yet, it was the only path left. Ethan looked at the widow, at her child curled in her arms. Their eyes met, trust and fear woven together. "I will not let them take you," Ethan said, his voice low, steady like iron. The widow's lips trembled, but she nodded. Outside, the storm howled again, carrying with it the sound of the colony's hunting dogs. And inside, Ethan prepared for the only choice left: to run before the betrayal finished its work. The storm returned with fury. Winds roared like beasts. Snow slammed against the colony walls, turning the night into white blindness. Inside his small home, Ethan moved with quiet urgency. The widow held her child close, watching with wide eyes as Ethan packed supplies into an old transport pack. Dried food, water capsules, heating rods, a battered map of the outer snowfields. Everything they would need if they were to escape. The word burned in Ethan's chest, heavy but certain. The betrayal, the guards, the hidden recorders, it was all too much. The colony was no longer a place of survival, it was a cage. And cages always break the spirit of those trapped inside. But tonight the storm could hide them. If they moved quickly, the wind and snow might cover their tracks. The widow whispered, her voice trembling, "Where will we go?" Ethan glanced at her, his jaw tight. "There's an abandoned supply outpost beyond the ice ridge. Old tunnels still run there. If we reach it, we might survive." Her eyes lowered, clutching her child tighter. "Might," she repeated softly, the word heavy with doubt. Ethan strapped on his coat, pulling up the hood. "Better than waiting. Here for death," he said firmly. He checked the side hatch of his home, a narrow door rarely used. The storm screamed outside, a shield of snow and wind. It was their only chance. The widow followed him, the child bundled in blankets. Every step was heavy, every movement full of fear. Ethan pushed the door open, the storm hitting them like knives. Cold stole their breath. Snow blinded their eyes, but they stepped out, leaving the small home behind forever. The colony was not asleep. Patrol drones buzzed in the distance, their lights flashing red in the snow. Guards moved in pairs along the streets, their visors glowing. Ethan led the widow through narrow alleys, his footsteps covered by the storm. He knew the paths, every crack in the walls, every broken panel. For years he had repaired them, and now they were his escape routes. They reached the outer fence, tall and sharp, electric currents sparking through the wires. Beyond it lay the endless snowfields. No safety, no walls, but freedom. Ethan pulled out a small tool, his hand steady despite the cold. He cut through a section where the current was weakest, sparks flashing in the dark. The widow held her child tighter, whispering prayers in her tongue. At last the metal split, leaving a narrow gap. Ethan motioned them through, his breath harsh in the freezing air. But the storm was not enough to hide everything. A drone scanned the fence, its red light sweeping across the snow. Ethan pushed the widow through the gap, then slipped after her. The light caught their trail. The drone shrieked in alarm. Sirens burst to life across the colony. Guards shouted. Voices carried on the storm. "They're escaping! Stop them!" The widow gasped, clutching her child. Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "Run!" he shouted against the wind. "Don't stop!" They ran into the storm, snow swallowing their figures. Behind them, light spread across the colony wall. Guards chasing with rifles ready. The snowfield was endless. Every direction the same white hell. But Ethan knew the way, his eyes fixed on the outline of the distant ridge. If they reached the tunnels, they might live. If not, the storm or the guards would claim them. Blaster fire cut through the snow. Red beams flashing past, one struck the ground near Ethan's feet, throwing snow into his face. He pulled the widow behind a ridge of ice, shielding her and the child. The storm screamed louder, covering their shouts. Ethan pulled out a small flare, but it was no signal. It was bait. He lit it, tossed it far to the left. The red light burned through the storm, drawing the guards toward it. "Move now," Ethan urged, leading them in the opposite direction. They ran, stumbling, falling, rising again. The child whimpered, but the storm swallowed the sound. Ethan's legs burned, his chest ached, but he did not slow. The widow's strength was failing, but Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her onward. Every step was survival, every breath a battle. Finally, through the snow, the dark mouth of the abandoned outpost appeared, a black opening against the white, hidden at the base of the ridge. Ethan's heart surged, hope rising. But hope was fragile. The sirens still wailed in the distance, and the red lights of drones. Still cut through the storm, they reached the entrance, slipping inside. The storm's roar dimmed, replaced by hollow echoes. The tunnels stretched before them, old and rusted but shelter. The widow collapsed against the wall, holding her child, tears streaming down her frozen face. Ethan leaned against the stone, his breath harsh. For the first time since the night began, they were out of sight, but safety was still far away. The guards would not stop. The drones would not rest. The colony had already marked Ethan as a traitor. He had crossed a line no one returned from. But as he looked at the widow and her child, alive in the flickering light of the old tunnels, he felt no regret. He had chosen, and his choice was life, not silence. And for that choice, he was ready to fight the whole colony if he had to. The tunnels of the outpost were cold and hollow. Rust dripped from the ceiling. Old pipes groaned, and the air smelled of dust and iron. But to Ethan, the widow and her child, it was shelter. For the first time since leaving his home, there were walls between them and the storm. For the first time. The child slept without shivering, yet safety was only an illusion. Ethan knew the colony would not stop. He had broken their law, defied their order, and they would hunt him until the snow buried his bones. The widow sat near the tunnel wall, her child resting on her lap, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "You risked everything," she whispered. "For us." Ethan shook his head, staring into the shadows of the tunnel. "No," he said firmly. "For what is right." The sound of engines broke the silence. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The colony's hunters were coming, their transport vehicles crunching through the snow above. Their scanners would soon find the tunnel entrance. Time was running out. Ethan searched the outpost quickly. He found broken machines, rusted crates, an old power terminal flickering. With weak light, he pulled wires, adjusted panels, his hands moving with the skill of a mechanic who had built his life on repairs. The widow watched him, fear and hope mixing in her eyes. "What are you doing?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Turning this place into a trap," he answered. Above, the hunters arrived. Boots stomped through the snow. Voices shouted. Orders. "Find them, no mercy," one barked. Lights cut through the storm. Drones buzzed down into the tunnel mouth. The chase was not over. It had only just begun. Ethan guided the widow and child deeper into the tunnels. "Stay low. Stay quiet," he whispered. Then he turned back, wires sparking in his hands. He had connected the old power system to the outer doors. If the hunters forced their way inside, the system would overload, collapsing the entry tunnel. It was dangerous. It might bury them all, but danger was already their life. The first drone flew in, its red light sweeping across the walls. Ethan grabbed a broken pipe, swinging it hard. The drone sparked, crashing into the floor, but the noise gave them away. Hunters rushed in, rifles glowing, their shouts echoing through the dark. Ethan ran, leading them deeper. Blaster fire tore chunks of metal from the walls. Sparks rained down. The widow clutched her child, tears streaming, whispering words in her own tongue. Ethan stopped at a junction, turning sharply, his mind racing. He pulled a lever, and the old terminal hummed. The ground shook as the tunnel entrance collapsed behind them, sealing the hunters inside the dark with them. Dust filled the air. The sound of stone crashing thundered. The widow gasped. "Now we are trapped too." Ethan coughed, his eyes burning, but his voice was steady. Better trapped together than dead in the snow. But the hunters were not finished. Their voices still echoed in the dark, closer. Ethan grabbed a piece of pipe and faced the shadows. His body shook with exhaustion, but his will was iron. He had not chosen this fight. But now it was his fight. Human against the colony. One man, standing for what they all refused to see. The hunters came, their visors glowing, rifles raised. Ethan roared and swung, the pipe crashing against armor, sparks flying. He fought with the strength of desperation, every strike fueled by anger and defiance. The widow screamed, holding her child, tears burning her eyes. The hunters fired, the tunnels shook. But Ethan's rage burned brighter than their weapons. He smashed the last terminal, wires sparking. The lights of the outpost flickered, then exploded. Darkness swallowed everything. In that blackness, chaos reigned. Hunters shouting, drones crashing. Ethan grabbed the widow's hand, pulling her. Through a narrow shaft, they crawled, scraped, bled, but they moved. And finally, they emerged into the storm again, the night sky wide and wild. Behind them, the outpost collapsed, burying the hunters in the dark. The widow fell to her knees, clutching her child, sobbing. Ethan stood in the snow, staring back at the ruins, his chest heaving. He was alive, but no longer a colonist. The colony would mark him outlaw, traitor, enemy. But he had chosen his side, and his side was life. The widow looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and sorrow. "You saved us," she whispered. "When no one else would. I will never forget." Her words carried weight, heavier than the storm. Ethan looked at her child, small eyes staring up at him, innocent and unbroken. And in that gaze, Ethan found strength. The storm howled, the snow endless. But beyond the ridge lay open land. Land no colony controlled, a place where survival was cruel but free. Ethan lifted his pack, his voice firm. "Then we walk and we keep walking," he said. The widow nodded, rising to stand beside him. Together they stepped into the storm. Not human, not alien, but survivors. And somewhere in the distance the storm carried a whisper. That one human had stood against the colony and changed everything.